Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It was the kind of summer heat that made lace curtains droop, kind that slowed the air, thickened the shade, and made even cicadas second-guess their song. In Greenwood, the so-called Black Wall Street of Tulsa, the days moved slowly in May of 1921. Women in cotton dresses fanned themselves on porches. Men in pressed collars mopped their brows in barbershops. And somewhere behind one of those small wooden houses, a little girl leaned on a windowsill and looked out. She didn't know that everything was about to end. Her name was never written down in the newspapers. She never spoke on a witness stand or published a memoir. She might have been 7 or 8 or younger. Her hair was probably braided in ribbons. Her shoes likely had scuff marks across the toes. She may have loved strawberry jam, or had a kitten she carried like a baby, or a brother who made her laugh when she didn't want to. What we know is this: on the night of May 31st, she was there. That window overlooked the street where prosperity once walked. Greenwood Avenue was lined with hotels, beauty parlors, cafes, theaters, even a library, all black-owned. It was not just a neighborhood, it was a testament to what Black Americans had built after freedom. People had come from Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. They came with farming calluses, with quiet dreams, and they had built something strong enough to be envied, and envied it was, across the railroad tracks. Tulsa's white citizens looked at Greenwood with something more dangerous than resentment fear. How had these people, just a generation out of slavery, made themselves so unignorable? The fear didn't live in words. It lived in sideways glances, in muttered jokes, in decisions made behind closed doors. The girl in the window didn't know any of this, but the adults around her did. They had been warned before quietly, sometimes violently not, to step too far. And then, on the afternoon of May 30th, it happened. It began with an elevator ride. A black teenager named Dick Rowland, working as a shoe shiner downtown, stepped into an elevator operated by a white teenage girl named Sarah Page. Something startled her, maybe a stumble, maybe a scream. No one knows. She later refused to press charges, but the headline the next morning screamed "Nab Negro" for attacking girl in elevator. That was enough. By evening, a white mob had gathered at the courthouse, demanding Rowland be handed over. A group of black veterans from Greenwood arrived, armed, disciplined, remembering what had happened in other towns. They wouldn't let another lynching happen without resistance. Then came the spark. A shot rang out, and all the tension that had been simmering for years boiled over. That night, the little girl in the window might have heard her father whisper something urgent to her mother, might have seen him load a rifle, might have been told to get under the bed, or to lie still with the baby and not make a sound. What followed was a nightmare. White mobs, armed and deputized by local authorities, stormed Greenwood. They looted homes, set fires, shot indiscriminately. The National Guard arrived, but instead of stopping the destruction, they rounded up black residents and marched them away at gunpoint. The girl in the window, if she was still near it, would have seen flames bloom across rooftops. She would have heard screams and the crackle of gunfire. She might have seen her school burn, her neighbor's porch collapse, her uncle fall in the street. By dawn, much of Greenwood was Ashdod churches, businesses. Over 1,000 homes gone, as many as 300 people killed, thousands more displaced. But the numbers could never account for what was lost in the minds of the children like her. In the days that followed, she would not go home. There was no home. Her mother might have found a scrap of blanket to wrap around her shoulders. Her father might not have come back at all. She would have stood in lines she didn't understand, herded into fairgrounds, guarded by men in uniforms. Her name not recorded, her grief not measured. The city of Tulsa called it a riot, but for the children, it was a rupture. Their memories would not come in full sentences, just moments. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of their mother's voice cracking, a hand pulling them through a broken fence. A lullaby interrupted. Some of them would be sent to relatives in Kansas or Chicago. Some would live in tents through the winter. Some would stay in Tulsa and learn not to speak of it. The silence was taught early, because to speak of it meant danger, and to ask for justice meant trouble. And so the children grew quiet, not because they had forgotten, but because no one was listening. Years later, when the girl in the window had become a woman, if she survived, she may have passed that same street corner and not said a word. The buildings would have changed. A gas station here, a parking lot there. People would walk by, not knowing what once stood, not knowing who once stood there, and when they looked at her face, they wouldn't see the little girl watching fire bloom in the dark. They would just see an old woman with something unspeakable behind her eyes. She never called it a camp, not even years later. Not when her children asked where she'd gone after the fire. Not when her own grandchildren pointed to the charred corner of a photograph and asked, "Was this your house?" She would only say, "That was the fairgrounds. We stayed there for a while." And then she changed the subject. The Tulsa County Fairgrounds had once been a place of livestock shows and pining contests. But in the first week of June 1921, it became a makeshift prison for thousands of black families, with homes destroyed and streets smoldering. Survivors were marched at gunpoint into these open lots and barns fenced in, watched by armed men, surrounded by barbed wire and humiliation. The little girl in the window, whose name has been lost to silence, may have arrived barefoot, or she may have worn one shoe and carried the other, broken. She may have clutched her mother's hand so tightly her fingernails left little crescent moons in her palm. The adults around her said very little. Their faces were tight, their hands occupied with whatever had been saved: a folded coat, a half-empty pail, a Bible with smoke-curled edges. There was no running water, no heat, no food, unless it was passed in by white volunteers who stared, sometimes kindly, sometimes coldly. The girl had never tasted soup from a can before. Now it was all she ate. There were no beds, only straw scattered across the dirt. Families, huddled together, made blankets from coats, whispered lullabies that didn't quite land because the world no longer made sense. At night, sounds that echoed through the fairgrounds weren't the low of cattle or the cheer of carnival rides. They were the quiet sobs of parents trying to keep their children from remembering. But children remember, even when the remembering comes later. The little girl began to ask questions. Why can't we go home? Why is everyone crying? Why are the men with guns standing at the gate? But her mother would only hush her. And when the girl pushed again, when she asked about the neighbors, or her missing brother, or the store on the corner, her mother simply said, "The sky is listening." So the girl learned the art of quiet. She learned to mimic the shape of her mother's grief without understanding it. She learned not to speak when the guards passed by. She learned to wait in line for food without asking what it was. And most of all, she learned to pretend she didn't see the man who screamed at night and had to be tied down with belts. Didn't see the woman who sat every day in the same spot, staring at her burned hands. Didn't see the toddler who coughed until he stopped breathing. There was a silence in the fairgrounds that pressed into the lungs like smoke. It wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the silence of waiting. And inside it, the children waited too, for someone to say it was over, for someone to come looking for them, for someone to say that what had happened wasn't normal. But no one came after the first few days. Some families were released, but only if a white employer vouched for them. This strange new rule meant survival hinged on dependency. A man who once ran his own store now had to beg for a letter from a butcher just to leave the grounds. A woman who once owned a salon needed permission to re-enter the city she helped build. The little girl's father never returned, so her mother stood alone in that line. When their name was finally called, they were given a small paper slip and told to keep it with them. It was a kind of pass, a promise that they wouldn't cause trouble. She folded it and kept it in the hem of her dress, and then they walked back toward what used to be Greenwood. The streets were still warm from the fires. Bricks lay in jagged heaps where schools had once stood. Telephones, wires curled like dead vines. The girl looked for landmarks, but found only ghosts. Her friend Clara's porch was gone. So was the flower shop where she once watched a man buy peonies for a Sunday wedding. The church steeple that touched the sky had collapsed, and the bakery that sold cinnamon bread had vanished. But people were already rebuilding with what little remained. Families began to clear debris, hammer together boards, build tents over scorched soil. They borrowed tools, shared soup, braided each other's hair while standing in the dust. The girl and her mother found a small corner near what had once been a school. With the help of other women, they built a lean-to from salvaged planks. It leaked when it rained, but it stood, and it meant she could sleep without fences again. For the children, this new life felt like walking through a story no one would read. No one taught them what had happened. The schools, when they reopened, never spoke of the massacre. No books recorded the names of the children who disappeared. No songs were written about the fairgrounds. The papers said it was a riot and that both sides had suffered losses. But the girl knew better. She remembered who had the guns. She remembered who lit the fires. She remembered that no white families had been marched into pens. Still, she did not speak of it. Not at first. Not for decades. Because there were other things to do, like survive, like rebuild, like forget, at least on the surface. And so, she grew up. She became a young woman. She married a man who had also lost half his street. They opened a small shop, okay? She had 3 children, okay? She gave them books and combed their hair and told them bedtime stories that always had happy endings. But when they asked her about her childhood, she paused and said only, "We had a window, and then we didn't." Years later, when the city finally began to talk after the silence had hardened into denial, investigators came looking for stories. Historians knocked on doors. Journalists asked questions. Commissions were formed. But by then, most of the children had grown old, and many had passed without ever telling anyone what they'd seen. The woman who had once been the little girl in the window was now in her 70s. She sat on a porch in North Tulsa, listening to the radio. When a reporter came asking, she said only one thing: they put us in the pens like cattle, but we were still children. And then she went back inside. She never called it grief, not aloud. It moved through her instead, like a shadow that knew when to stay low, when to stay quiet, and when to return. It wasn't a wailing sort of sorrow. It was the kind that sat beside you when you stirred beans in a pot and couldn't remember where you learned how. It curled up behind your spine when the weather turned warm and something, the scent of scorched earth, came rushing back. She was a child in Greenwood when the sky turned orange, and she was a woman now, still living in Tulsa, still calling it home, though no one had ever truly come back. There had been no monument, no reparations, no day of remembrance when she was young. For years, even decades, the city tried to pretend it had never happened. Insurance companies refused to pay claims to black families. The mayor called it a Negro uprising. The white men who had burned and looted were never charged. And those who survived children like her were told, gently or harshly, to forget, so they did, at least outwardly. They got jobs, married, prayed, raised children. They sat through sermons and drank sweet tea and nodded during speeches about progress. But the grief was always there. It showed up in strange places, at the butcher counter, when someone pushed in front of her and called her gal, in the church choir, when the soprano reminded her of her mother's voice that last night, in the smell of burning leaves in October, in the sound of hammers in June, even the way her daughter's small fingers traced the windowsill on a sunny morning. Even that made her chest ache in ways she could not name, 'cause she had once stood at a windowsill, and then there had been fire. But she said nothing. The language of survival didn't include words like trauma or healing back then. What it did include was perseverance, dignity, silence, especially around white ears. The few times she tried to explain to her children what she'd seen, they stared, wide-eyed, not knowing if she was making it up. Their school books made no mention of Greenwood. No one told them their own mother had once lived in one of the richest black neighborhoods in the nation. It had been erased, but not completely. She remembered the street names. She remembered the smell of her father's cologne before he left that night. She remembered the shape of the flames as they took her neighbor's roof. She remembered how many hours they walked before the sun rose again. And sometimes, when she could not sleep, she would take out the slip of paper, now faded and brittle, that her mother had kept all those years, the pass, the permission slip, that said they could leave the fairgrounds. It was not worth much in the world, but it was the only proof she had. Proof that they had been corralled like criminals. Proof that she had lived. Proof that she had survived something too large for a child to carry. The grief lived in the spaces between her words. It shaped how she moved through the world. She never bought fireworks on the 4th of July. She flinched when men argued too loudly on street corners. She always made her children leave a party before dark. She whispered when she said the word riot. But the worst part, the part that pulled at her, even when she was old and slow and mostly alone, was the knowing that no one had been held accountable. Not a single white man had gone to jail for what they did. Not the ones who lit the fires. Not the ones who shot children in doorways. Not the ones who stood grinning beside bodies. And when her grandchildren came home, one day with a school assignment about racial harmony, she felt something inside her crack not in anger, but in exhaustion, because harmony was not what she remembered. What she remembered was smoke. In her final years, she began to speak carefully, sparingly, but honestly. One day, a young historian from a nearby university came to her porch. He'd read about Greenwood in a dusty legal file and was trying to record oral testimonies. He carried a notebook and a microphone. She looked at him long and hard before letting him sit. He asked gently, "Can you tell me what you saw?" And she said, "No, but I can tell you what I heard." She spoke, softly, slowly, like she was unsure whether she wanted the story to survive. She told him about the sky that glowed red, about her mother's hands, shaking but steady, about the heat of the fairgrounds floor at night, about the boy next to her who stopped asking where his father was. She did not cry. She did not shout. She only said, "We were children, and we were told to be strong." So we were. The historian nodded, tears in his eyes, and she smiled sadly, because even now, the world wasn't ready for the full truth. In 1996, the city of Tulsa finally opened a formal commission to investigate what happened in 1921. Her name was among the list of survivors. She did not attend the hearings. Her legs were tired, her heart too. But she watched it on television, watched as newscasters described uncovering history as if it had ever been hidden. The history had been there all along, in the wrinkles of her hands, in the silence of her home, In the dreams, she no longer told anyone, and when they said they had found mass graves, she closed her eyes because she already knew. When she passed away, the obituary was simple. It did not mention Greenwood. It did not mention the fire. It only said she was born in Tulsa in 1913 and lived through many things. But her granddaughter knew. She had heard the stories, seen the old papers, felt the grief move like a current beneath the surface of their family. And so she stood at the funeral and said, "My grandmother survived something the world tried to forget, but we remember." And in that remembering, something sacred returned. In Greenwood today, there are murals, there are plaques, there are people walking the streets again, telling stories. Some of those stories are polished, others are raw, but woven between them all is the invisible thread of those who once sat at windowsills and watched the world burn. Children like her, who did not ask for history, but carried it anyway. And even now, their grief lingers in the wind that moves through. Tulsa quiet, patient, still waiting for the world to listen. He was only 10 when the world caught fire. His name was Isaiah, though no one used it properly. His mother called him Zay. His uncle called him that fool child with a pencil. And his teachers, when they weren't ignoring him, wrote his name crooked in chalk, then smudged it by accident. But to himself, Isaiah was nobody and everybody. He didn't speak much, didn't play much. He only drew. He drew faces in the condensation on the schoolroom windows, drew animals on the margins of his reading books, drew entire city blocks on the back of butcher paper his uncle brought home from the store. And when no one was looking, he'd even drawn the inside of his shoes, where the leather wore dainty, delicate sketches of buildings he'd seen on walks with his father. It was the only place he could keep them safe. Tulsa was a map in his head. The bakery on Greenwood with the caramel pies, the barber shop with the red and white pole, the hotel where men in suits laughed on the balconies, the church his mother cried in every Sunday, her handkerchief folded. Just so he drew them all, carefully, obsessively, as if he already knew something was about to be taken from him. Isaiah was not a loud child, but his drawings spoke loud. He once sketched a portrait of his teacher so accurately that her face softened when she saw it. She gave him a peppermint and told him he had a God-given gift, then forgot about him again. But the peppermint lasted. He remembered the sweetness on his tongue as he crouched under the pews during the riot. It came so quickly. One afternoon, he was drawing a garden gate outside the hardware store. The next, he was running barefoot across broken glass while his mother screamed his name behind him. The smoke didn't smell like firewood. It smelled like everything good in the world was being unstitched. He saw it all. The hotel in flames. The schoolhouse collapsing in silence. A boy he knew, James, lying face down with a boot print on his back. He saw men with rifles and vests, white men who grinned like they were hunting rabbits. And then he saw the church. It was not burning yet, it was trembling. Isaiah grabbed his sister's hand. She was 6, maybe 7, small and confused and clinging to him like a question. He didn't speak. He only ran, down the alley, through the garden, past the cracked water pump. He did not cry, did not shout, did not even whisper when the flames lit the sky like dawn in reverse. All he carried was her hand and the tiny sketches in his shoes. They hid beneath the porch until morning. Their mother found them by scent, not sight. She knelt beside the porch and whispered their names like a prayer she'd already lost. When Isaiah looked up at her, he didn't see her face. He saw the soot, the sweat, the blackened fingertips that had once sewn his shirt buttons. She said only one thing: they burned it all. And she was right. They were herded to the fairgrounds like animals, counted, questioned, branded not with iron, but with silence. No one asked what Isaiah had seen. No one asked if he still had his drawings. No one asked if his heart was still beating the same way, but he drew anyway, on a scrap of newspaper he found behind the food tent. He drew the hotel as he remembered it before the fire. On a piece of cardboard, he drew the man who gave them water. On the sole of his right shoe, he drew his mother's face. He told no one, because art wasn't meant for telling. It was for keeping, it's for remembering. And Isaiah remembered everything. They lived with an aunt in Chicago after that. The train ride was long, dark, and full of wrong accents. People called him boy with too many syllables. His sister forgot her favorite lullaby. Their mother worked night shifts at a soap factory and came home smelling like lavender and heat. But Isaiah kept drawing. He drew streetcars and alleys, drew the curve of Lake Michigan, drew the old house back in Greenwood from memory, and he hid the pictures because no one wanted to hear about Tulsa, not in school, not at church, not even at home, where the air was thick with unspoken things. His mother refused to say the word massacre. She called it the trouble, or sometimes just that night. And his sister grew up believing Greenwood had always been a dream. But Isaiah remembered when he turned 15, he got a job sweeping a barbershop. The owner, Mr. Bell, had also come from Oklahoma. He noticed Isaiah's drawings, once little thumbnails of faces on the back of receipts, and he didn't say much, just nodded once and handed the boy an old sketch pad with yellowed pages. "Don't stop," he said. So Isaiah didn't. He drew at night, drew before school, drew on napkins and newspaper margins, and even on the back of his own hand when no paper was near. And always, always, he drew Tulsa. Not just the buildings, but the fire, the faces, the way the sky looked when everything beautiful was being erased. Years passed. The world forgot about Greenwood. The papers never printed retractions. The officials never admitted fault. History books stayed quiet. But Isaiah's drawings multiplied. He collected them in boxes, stored them under his bed. Once, when his mother was hospitalized, he brought one to her, a sketch of the church as it had been. She looked at it for a long time, then turned her face to the wall. But Isaiah knew she saw it. When he was 50, a journalist came to interview survivors. Isaiah said no at first, but then he opened the box. Inside were hundreds of drawings, some smudged, others bright. Each one a memory, a testimony, a refusal to forget. The journalist stared. "Why did you keep these?" Isaiah answered softly. "Because they didn't let us speak, And the drawing spoke. Years later, when Tulsa finally began to reckon with its past, Isaiah's work was placed in a small museum gallery. People walked by his sketches and cried. Teachers brought students. Old men who had forgotten everything but names stood in front of his charcoal drawing of the fairgrounds and whispered prayers. Isaiah never stopped drawing. He passed away in sleep one spring morning, a pencil still resting near his hand. He left behind no autobiography, no speeches, no recordings, only sketches, thousands of them, each one saying the thing no one else would. When Isaiah's drawings were first unpacked by the museum curator, no one knew what to make of them. They were vivid, yes, evocative, emotional, but they were also ordinary, not the polished grandeur of gallery pieces. These were rough, personal, made with cheap pencils on ration paper, bus tickets, shoebox lids. Some were so faint they needed special light just to be seen. But when laid out side by side, chronologically, carefully, the effect was overwhelming. It wasn't a gallery. It was a memory. Not just Isaiah's memory, but the collective, quiet, remembering of an entire people who had once been told to forget. Each page was a window, a faded rendering of the Greenwood Library, complete with the reading room Isaiah never got to use. A thick-lined charcoal sketch of a woman shielding her baby as smoke bloomed around her like a curtain. A 4-inch scene scrawled onto the back of a sugar-boxed voice. barefoot, jumping puddles on Greenwood Avenue the morning before the sky turned black dot. And then there was the page, the one with no buildings, no sky, no people, just fire. Dozens of small fires, carefully drawn and arranged in a ring. Inside the ring was only empty space. The museum staff asked what it meant. No one knew, but one woman, a local teacher, stood staring at it for nearly an hour. Finally, she whispered, "That's the silence. That's what they did to us." For decades after the Tulsa Massacre, school children were not taught what happened. Not in Oklahoma, not in the South, not in the North, not anywhere. There were no chapters in textbooks, no public apologies, no holiday markers or remembrance events. The silence was so thorough, so precise, that even the children of survivors often didn't know what their own parents had lived through. Those who remembered were told to move on. Those who asked were told to behave. And yet, somehow, Isaiah's drawings survived. Not because they were protected by institutions or praised in his lifetime, but because he never stopped making them, never stopped drawing, never stopped recording. The things that weren't allowed to be said, even when it made no sense to do so, even when no one looked. Even when paper ran out, he always found a surface and a reason. When the Greenwood Gallery quietly opened in the corner of the Tulsa Historical Center, a man came to visit. Elderly, slow walking, careful. He had no appointment, simply walked the aisles with the silence of someone listening. Then, he stopped at a sketch of a girl under a stairwell. Her hands were raised. Her face had no eyes. He whispered one word, "Ruth." "Huh." The museum staff asked if he was family. "No," he said, softly. "She was my neighbor. She never made it out." He stood there for almost an hour. Then he added, "But she's here now, isn't she?" The children of the massacre had vanished in so many ways. Some fled to relatives in Chicago or Kansas City. Others were taken in by churches or orphaned entirely. Records were burned. Birth certificates went missing. Names were spelled wrong on official forms. Entire family trees splintered into silence. But every now and then, someone would walk into the gallery, see a drawing, start to cry. A woman from Milwaukee pointed to a sketch of a woman in a flowered dress and said, "That's my grandmother." A man from Detroit stared at a drawing of the burned schoolhouse and murmured, "I think I had a brother there." People came from everywhere. New Orleans, Atlanta, California. Some had stories. Some only had questions. All they had in common was a kind of ache. The ache of not knowing if their past was real, or just a feeling they'd carried their whole lives. Isaiah never said much in interviews. In one rare recording, an archivist asked him, "Why do you think they tried to erase Greenwood?" Isaiah paused for nearly a full minute, then said quietly, "Because it showed them we didn't need them." Another time, someone asked if he thought art could bring justice. He smiled. "Justice is too big for pencils," he said. "But memory fits just fine." Hay had drawn nearly 3,000 pieces over his lifetime, but he only signed 4 of them. The first was the drawing of his mother's face, hidden in the lining of his right shoe. The second was a quiet sketch of a little girl playing with a skipping rope, done entirely in blue pencil. The third was a picture of a burning church, seen from a distance. The fourth, found after his death, was a self-portrait young Isaiah holding his sister's hand, staring into the fire. It was signed in the lower corner with 3 letters. Z.E. White teachers began bringing school groups. They entered expecting to see history. Instead, they saw absence, hurt, hope, and the soft, stubborn voice of a boy who refused to forget. In one school's visitor book, a 5th grade student wrote, "It's weird. I feel like I met him, even though he's gone." Another child wrote, "Why didn't we learn about this before?" And under that, another hand wrote, "We are now." By the time the gallery became national news, Isaiah had already passed. He didn't see the headlines, didn't hear the speeches, didn't watch the commissions, or receive the honorary degrees they sent in his name. But maybe he didn't need to, because his drawings were still doing what they'd always done, saying the unspeakable, preserving what was lost, holding space for the children who had no place left to go. There is one final sketch one that never made it to the public displays. It was found inside the cover of an old shoebox in a folder simply labeled for later. The drawing shows Greenwood Avenue, rebuilt, clean, bright, full of life. Children are playing. A bookstore is open. A man is painting a sign above a shop door. In the distance, there is a church steeple with no fire behind it. In the bottom right corner, in Isaiah's small, careful handwriting, are the words, "What it could have been." In the winter of 1982, a woman named Lenora Ellis stood before the silent drawings in the Greenwood exhibit, her coat still damp from the snow outside. She hadn't planned to stay long, just a quick visit while in town for a teaching conference. But something in the hush of the gallery made her pause. It was the quiet, not an empty quiet, but a full one, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone to listen. She made it halfway down the corridor before her breath caught. It was a drawing of a church, or what had once been a church. The walls were scorched, the roof half gone. But what froze her wasn't the building, it was the tiny figure tucked in the corner of the frame. A small child, sketched in barely their strokes, clutching a doll. Lenora dropped her notebook because the doll was hers. She hadn't seen that face in nearly 6 decades, hadn't spoken of it to anyone but herself in the quiet corners of memory. Her family never told her what really happened that week. They said there was a fire, that she had to move, that some people didn't come back. But she remembered the smoke, the neighbors' screams, and the boy standing in the alley beside the burning church, staring at her through the flickering dark. He had nothing in his hands. She'd never known his name until that moment. Isaiah, the boy who drew the flames. It was his sketch of her. Somehow, after all those years, after all the shifting, erasing, silencing, he'd remembered her face, her doll, her stance, and he'd saved it. That night, Lenora didn't sleep. She sat at her hotel window, snow falling thick and slow, and wrote a letter to her granddaughter. She told her about the drawing, about that day, about what they'd lost, and about how one boy with a broken pencil and no audience had held on to everything she'd tried to bury. "I want you to see it," she wrote, "because it means we were really there." More letters came after that. People wrote from Baltimore, San Francisco, Montreal. Some were survivors. Some were the children or grandchildren of survivors. A few were strangers visitors who'd never heard of the Tulsa Massacre until they wandered into the gallery, expecting nothing, and left changed. One man wrote, "I didn't know my grandfather grew up there. I didn't know why he hated fireworks, or why he refused to talk about Oklahoma. I thought he just didn't like noise. Now I think he remembered this." Another wrote, "These drawings feel like someone whispering a truth we weren't supposed to hear. And now that I've heard it, I can't stop listening." It became a tradition every year on the anniversary of the massacre. The gallery opened early. No speeches, no cameras, just silence. Visitors were invited to walk the rows, to sit, to breathe, to eat, to write a name and a name on a small card in place. It beneath the frame that moved them most. Some left the names of real relatives. Others left names of those they imagined. Miss Ruth, 4th grade, Baby Lou, my uncle. By the end of the day, each drawing sat above a field of memory. Some cards had only initials. Some had poems. One simply said, "Thank you for remembering." The museum staff never cleaned them up. Instead, they gathered them into boxes marked whispers, and stored them in the archive. Every few years, they'd read a few aloud on a podcast episode or a community gathering, but mostly, they just kept them, because that, too, was a kind of honoring. Isaiah himself never attended the exhibits, not because he was shy, but because, as one archivist put it, he already knew what they looked like. He was rarely interviewed, climbed awards, lived in the same small apartment for 50 years, its walls layered with brown paper sketches taped edge to edge like ancient wallpaper. A visiting journalist once said it looked like the inside of a mind that wouldn't let go. And perhaps it was, Isaiah told her. They said we were supposed to move on, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. So I started drawing it instead. That way, it wouldn't follow me to sleep. One day in 1989, a local boy named Miles came into the gallery on a school trip. He was 12, wore headphones, didn't want to be there, but as the rest of the class drifted toward the snack bar, Miles stood in front of a charcoal drawing of 3 children sitting under a broken billboard. They were laughing. No fire, no blood, it's just laughter. He stared at it for so long that the chaperone had to gently take his arm and lead him away. That night, Miles went home and drew his mother's face for the first time. She cried when she saw it, not because it was perfect, but because it looked like her. It's how she saw herself, not how the world did. Miles became an artist when he got into art school. He wrote one name on his application under biggest influence, Isaiah. By the late 1990s, universities were teaching Isaiah's work alongside other protest artists, Diego Rivera, Jacob Lawrence, Keith Colvitz. But even among giants, Isaiah's pieces were different. They weren't painted for prestige. They weren't sold for profit. They weren't made for galleries at all. They were survival memory drawn by a boy whose world had burned, and who refused to let it be forgotten. Shortly before his passing, Isaiah donated every drawing he still possessed to the Greenwood Museum. No conditions, no fees, just a small note inside the final envelope that said, "Use them for the children." And they did. Every summer, the gallery held a quiet art camp. No fees, no ads, just paper, pencils, and soft-spoken instructors, many of them descendants of Greenwood survivors. The children who came were not all artists, but they learned to listen, to sit with silence, to draw what could not be said. One little girl drew the sound her grandmother made. She thought no one was in the room. Another boy sketched what it looked like when he tried to speak at school, and no one heard. They pinned their drawings beside Isaiah's originals, forming a long paper mural of pain and memory and survival that stretched around the entire building. Each summer, it got longer, and then, one day, a girl named Juna found a pencil wedged in the floorboards of the north classroom. It was old, dull, wrapped in a piece of twine. Someone joked that maybe it belonged to Isaiah. Juna held it like a wand. She didn't say anything, but later that day, she drew a picture of a fire, and in the center of it, a boy with no mouth, holding a dog. Years from now, when this mural is archived and those children are grown, someone else will walk into a quiet room. They'll see a paper face that looks like someone they knew. They'll feel a tightness in their chest they can't explain, and they'll whisper, "I think they remembered me." She was 9 when she first touched the violin. Her name was Lillian Monroe, and the year was 1920, just 1 year before the massacre. Her fingers were too small, her shoes too tight, and her violin had a crack in the side from a tumble it took off the altar steps at Vernon Ames Church. No one ever fixed it, but it still played. And when Lillian drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the note wobbled like a baby bird finding its wings. Everyone in the basement classroom laughed. But Lillian didn't mind, because she had heard something in that sound of shimmer beneath the scratch. A whisper through the noise. Something that belonged only to her. That night, she didn't sleep. She set the violin on the wooden crate beside her cot, careful not to jostle it. She covered it with a flour sack. And sometime near dawn, her mother found her sitting up, eyes wide open, just listening. "What do you hear, baby?" Lillian whispered. "It's not done singing yet." She practiced every day after that in a borrowed corner of the church basement, by the fire escape behind the bakery, underneath the bed, while her father mended his boots. She played when it rained, and when it didn't, she played while her little brother recited his spelling words. She played even when her bow began to fray, till one morning the tip snapped clear off. She cried for a full hour, then took a twig from the yard, shaved it smooth with a paring knife, and tied horsehair to it, using thread pulled from her own socks. It didn't sound good, but it worked. That was the day her father called her little Miss Stubborn String. Lillian's teacher, Miss Cordella, was a widow who had once played in Chicago's colored orchestra. She had arthritic fingers and a voice like a whisper through parchment, but she carried music like others carried breath. On warm Saturdays, she'd gather the children under the sycamores and lead them through Batch and DVOK and sorrow songs from the Carolinas. Lillian loved DVOK the most. Something about the lilt of it, the way the notes leaned into each other like tired shoulders. Cordella said Lillian played like someone twice her age and half her weight. At night, Lillian practiced until her fingers buzzed. On Sundays, she'd sneak into the church early to test the acoustics under the choir loft. She told herself, "Someday we'll fill this whole building with my sound." But someday would never come. It was the 3rd day of June, T-1921, when Greenwood burned. Lillian had hidden the violin inside her coat, cradling it like a wounded pet. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just ran past the butcher shop, past the smoldering drugstore, past the charred shell of Cordella's home. The bow was left behind. Only the violin made it out. That night, they slept in a field beneath a broken fence, surrounded by other families with nowhere to go. Lillian held the violin tight, but she did not play it. Not that night. Not ever again. They moved to Kansas. Lillian stopped school after the 6th grade and found work mending buttons at a sewing house. Her hands grew calloused, her back hunched. The violin remained under her bed, wrapped in the same flour sack she had used years ago. No one asked about it, and she never offered. For 63 years, it remained silent. In 1984, grandson Michael came home from college with a Walkman, a book of jazz history, and a quiet sadness that Lillian couldn't name. He'd been studying music saxophone, mostly, but something had changed. He no longer played in front of people. Said the noise in his head made it hard to concentrate. One afternoon, while helping Lillian clean, he found the old violin case in the closet. "What's this, Grandma?" She didn't answer. He opened it. The strings were rusted, the bridge warped, but the curve of the wood still shimmered in the light. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Lillian sat down. For a long time, she just stared at the thing. Then, she said, "It was my voice once." Michael looked up. "Can I fix it?" Lillian nodded, but quietly added, "It doesn't want to be played." But Michael played it anyway, gently, slowly, one string at a time. He spent weeks soaking the pegs, sanding the bridge, replacing the strings. He crafted a new bow from a branch in the backyard, just as Lillian had once done. And when he finally coaxed the first note from the newly minted body, Lillian was in the next room. She dropped her spoon into the sink, because it sounded just like that day in 1920, like something not done singing yet. Lillian began humming again, not full melodies, just fragments, bits of sorrow songs, snippets of DVOK, a phrase or two from the hymns Cordella used to teach. Michael recorded them on a cassette. Then he asked her, "Would you teach me?" Lillian laughed. "I forgot everything I ever knew." But that wasn't true, because when she picked up the bow. Her fingers remembered for the next 3 summers. Michael and Lillian played together every evening at sunset. Sitting on the back porch facing west, neighbors would come by and sit on the grass, bringing their children, their folding chairs, their lemonade. No one applauded. No one recorded. They just listened. And slowly, neighborhood began to hum again. In 1989, historian researching Greenwood stumbled upon a community bulletin board in Kansas that read violin porch music. Wednesdays at 7, she followed the note to a modest home on Sycamore Street. Lillian, now 77, was tuning the violin when she arrived. The historian sat, listened, then wept. She wrote about the evening in her dissertation. Later, the book. Later still, in a documentary. And soon, people from Tulsa, Denver, Memphis, and Atlanta began writing letters to Lillian, asking, "Is it true? Were you there?" Lillian never gave interviews. She didn't speak at conferences. She didn't sign autographs, but every Wednesday until the day she passed, she played her violin on the porch at 7 p.m. 1 hour, no more. Sometimes it was just her and Michael. Sometimes 10 people. Sometimes 50. Once, a woman drove 8 hours from Texas just to sit on the grass and listen. She left a note. "You are the first sound I've heard that felt like home." Lillian passed quietly in her sleep in 1994. Michael wrapped the violin in its flour sack and carried it to Tulsa. He didn't bring it to a museum. He brought it to Vernon AIM Church. They were rebuilding part of the choir loft. He asked to place it in the cornerstone. The elders agreed. But first, he played one last note, a soft, shimmering G dot, then sealed the violin in stone. If you visit that church today and listen near the south wall just after a rain, you might hear something. Not a melody, not quite, but a shimmer beneath the silence, like something not done singing yet. The violin may have been sealed in stone, but the sound it left behind seemed to linger, not in the church pews or in the dusty pages of history books, but in the people who had once sat quietly on folding chairs in Lillian's backyard. Returned to their homes some hundreds of miles away, and they carried the memory like a soft ache behind the ribs. Not dramatic, not tragic, not even quite sad. Persistent, like a hum you notice only when the room goes still. One of them was a girl named Ava. She had come with her grandmother, who had read about Lillian in a local newsletter. Ava was 10 at the time. Her grandmother said, "We're going to visit someone who never stopped listening." She didn't understand what that meant, but they brought lemonade in a jar, and they sat under a peach tree in the corner of the yard. It was warm. The sky was pink. The violin was older than everyone in the crowd. Ava didn't remember the song Lillian played, but she remembered the way Lillian's hands trembled, and the way the trembling stopped the moment she placed a bow to the string. Something inside her had clicked into place, like shutters opening inward, and for the first time in her short life, Ava felt like she had seen time slow down. Years later, Ava became a teacher. Not of music. She wasn't gifted like that, but she kept a battered cassette tape in her desk drawer. High. One side was blank. The other had an old recording of Lillian and Michael playing a duet. She never showed it to anyone. But whenever a student seemed quietly lost, the kind of loss that doesn't show up on report cards, she'd ask if they wanted to stay after class for something different. They always said yes, and she'd play the tape just once, and they'd sit side by side with no expectations. Some said nothing, cried. Some laughed nervously and asked who the musicians were. Ava always gave the same answer. It was a girl who knew how to listen to things most people couldn't hear. She never said the girl's name, because the name wasn't the point. Michael, too, carried the violin with him, not literally, not anymore, but in the shape of his days. After Lillian passed, He took up teaching at a small arts college in Tulsa. He never called himself a master. He rarely performed. But his students quickly learned there was something strange about the way he taught. Music. He never told them what was right. He told them what was still listening. If a note feels unfinished, he'd say, don't rush it. It might be waiting for you to listen back. They thought it was metaphor. It WASN. Single quotes. One day, student asked if the story of the sealed violin was true. Michael said, it was never about the violin. The student nodded as if he understood. Years later, he admitted he didn't. Not then, but one night, long after graduation. That same student found himself stuck in a motel in Kansas, halfway through a drive he hadn't planned. The radio didn't work. The air conditioner wheezed like a sad accordion. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he thought of Michael's words. He sat down, closed his eyes. Can began humming. He didn't stop until morning. He said it was the first time he'd ever written a melody that felt like it belonged to the ground beneath him, not just to his fingers. He called it Porch Light, back in Tulsa. The small plaque that marked the cornerstone of Vernon. Akeem didn't say much, just to the girl who never stopped playing. 1922, 1994. Most visitors didn't notice it. A few did. Hey? Few asked, and a very small number walked away feeling a little different. Like something unspoken had pressed past their shoulder. They couldn't name it. They just knew in 2007, a woman named Regina found an old flour sack in her grandmother's attic. Inside was a broken bough, a strip of frayed horsehair, and a note folded so many times it looked like pressed lace. The note read, if ever I forget what it felt like to hear my own sound, may this remind me. LM, there was no violin, only silence. But Regina kept the bow. She placed it in a glass frame above her writing desk. Years later, she published a book of poems titled Notes Between the Fire. She never mentioned Lillian by name. She didn't have to. Across the country, scattered like seeds on the wind, were dozens of small acts that didn't seem connected at first. A cello player who started a porch concert series in Detroit. A music therapist in Atlanta who swore that humming helped her patients more than talking. A podcaster in Oregon who opened every episode with 5 seconds of static, followed by a single drawn-out G note on a string instrument that no one could identify. When asked about it, he'd only say, it's from something that never quite ended. Michael passed in 2021 on the 100th anniversary of the massacre. The church held a quiet service. Quiet, no press, no speeches, just an old cassette player brought out from storage. The choir didn't sing, the tape did. A duet between Lillian and Michael. Faint, scratchy, but unmistakably there's it, played once. Then the sanctuary fell into silence and remained. That way, no one moved to fill the space, because they knew what Lillian knew. The music was not done outside. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with birds, hundreds of them, rising from trees all at once, as if summoned by something below. They swirled, circled, then scattered. A girl watching from across the street said to her mother, it looks like they're listening. And maybe they were, because in that moment, across miles of soil and time, the violin played on not through speakers or strings, but through memory, through breath, through the small places where silence meets sound and becomes something else, something older, something that waits. There was no statue for Lillian, no school named in her honor, no historic landmark bearing a story in bronze, just wind, quiet wind, and the way it seemed to shift direction near certain buildings in Tulsa, the way it curved gently around corners, where bricks bore the ghosts of music that no longer had strings to ride on. Some called it coincidence. Some said it was the way cities breathe, but others, mostly older women, mostly ones who'd seen enough to know better, would whisper, she's still playing. And in the lull between thunder and summer rain, when the gutters hadn't yet overflowed and the air felt like it was waiting for permission to fall asleep, you could sometimes hear it. A note, not loud, not even clear, just a tone that didn't belong to now. It's easy to forget how fragile memory is. Tulsa tried to forget many things. It tried to forget what happened in 1901. It tried to forget who had been left behind. And it tried, with subtle cruelty, to forget those who survived, not in the dramatic headlines or the official reports, but in the slow erosion of names, of stories, of details that might have anchored a life to the present. Lillian was almost one of those forgotten ones, almost, but memory has strange anchors. It doesn't always need photographs or graves. Sometimes it only needs one stubborn melody that refuses to stop humming in the minds of people who don't know where they heard it, only that they did. Ava, the little girl who once sat beneath the peach tree, eventually retired from teaching. Her school gave her a cake, a plaque, a soft farewell. But Ava didn't keep the plaque. She gave it to a custodian named Reggie, who always came to the music room after hours to mop the floors, slowly, while listening to jazz from his phone speaker. "You understand sound," she said. "This belongs more to you than me." Reggie smiled, confused. Then he nodded, because he did understand. Not the reasoning, just the rhythm of the gesture. That night, Ava drove out to the place where Lillian's house used to be. It had long been demolished by town during a failed redevelopment effort. Now it was just an empty patch of grass surrounded by a chain-link fence and a sad nitrogen monoxide trespassing sign with half its letters faded by sun. But Ava parked across the street and rolled down the window. No cassette player, no violin, just air. She sat there for 23 minutes, didn't cry, didn't think, didn't even close her eyes, just listened. And as the wind pushed a single leaf across the curb, scraping like a faint bow across pavement, she whispered, "Thank you," and left. Somewhere, 2,000 miles away, a music student named Daniel had just woken from a dream. In it, he'd been walking through a garden of charred violins. Each one sat upright, as if resting, but none had strings. At the center was a red one, glowing like an ember, untouched by fire. He reached for it before his fingers made contact. He heard a woman's voice whispered into his ear, but directly into his chest. "You only get one sound. Listen closely." Then he woke, sweating, breathless, and somehow calm, weak. He wrote a song with only one chord. It was called Still, and it went viral. None of this was in the history books. None of it would be history prefers. Events with borders, beginnings, endings, quantifiable results. Lillian didn't fit into borders. Her sound bled through them, through basements, through time, through silence. Decades after the red violin was sealed in the cornerstone of Vernon AME, a new generation of local students proposed a restoration of the site. Not a tourist exhibit, it's just a place to gather, a place to listen. They raised money quietly. No GoFundMe, no press, just handwritten notes on bulletin boards. Modest dinners in church basements. And one evening concert played entirely from memory by 4 elderly musicians who never introduced themselves. Each song was a lullaby. Each lullaby had no known origin. Each origin felt like it had come from someone who understood pain without needing to explain it. The cornerstone was opened not to remove the violin, but to build around it. Gently, a glass casing was installed so future generations could see the old instrument, dulled by time, but still defiantly red beneath its cracks and varnish. No labels, just a small plaque that said, "This sound has not ended. Please listen gently." Visitors came. Not many, but some. One little boy asked his father, "What does it sound like?" The father said, "You have to be very still to hear it." So the boy tried, and though he heard nothing, he stayed still for a long, long time, longer than most adults ever do. And when they left, he turned back once more and whispered, "Good night." There are stories that end. This is not one of them, because in Tulsa, beneath the pavement, beneath the rain, beneath the songs no longer sung, there still hums a single, gentle note. It doesn't ask to be heard. It only waits, soft, persistent, alive. There are certain sounds a city never forgets. They may not echo through the streets anymore. They may not even be captured on old tape reels or surviving sheet music, but the silence they leave behind is shaped like them hollowed spaces where once something pure rang out in Greenwood, before the fires, before the gunshots and gasoline and smoke. There was such a sound, a children's choir that met every Thursday afternoon in the basement of the empty Zion Baptist Church. They were never recorded. They weren't famous. They wore second-hand robes and sang off-key more often than not. Their notes were jagged, their rhythms inconsistent, and their director, a tired widow named Mabel Thompson, insisted on keeping tempo by stomping her cane instead of using a baton. And yet, the sound those children made could steal the air, not with perfection, but with need. The orphaned choir. They were called not because they were all orphans, though some were. The name came later, after everything burned. The teas were reduced to ash, and the basement cracked open like a ribcage. After the ones who returned found nothing but silence, where once there had been voices, trying desperately to matter. It was meant as a joke at first, a cruel nickname whispered by some salsa locals, the kind who sneered at Greenwood's attempt to rise from ruin. But as the years passed, the phrase took root. It softened, became mournful, almost sacred. The orphaned choir, old women would say at community meetings. They were something, weren't they? And though no one could quite recall a full melody or verse, everyone who had ever heard them remembered how it felt. As if the children were singing just to stay visible in a world that didn't want to see them. In 1921, just days before the massacre, the choir had grown to nearly 24 children. Most were between 6 and 12. Some came barefoot. Others wore shoes far too small or large. Tane didn't all know how to read music, but they knew how to follow Mabel's voice. Mabel was not a musician. She had been a laundress most of her life, and her fingers were cracked from lye and heat. But she knew how to hum. She knew what grief sounded like when sung from the gut, and she taught the children to listen, not just to notes, but to breath, to silence, to the spaces between. That last Thursday, before the sky fell, she had made them practice an old spiritual .1 that had no title, just a single lyric, repeated like a heartbeat. "I'll be there when the wind comes down." Again and again they sang it, each time slower, each time with fewer voices, as Mabel pointed at one child, then another, instructing them to drop out, until only 3 were left singing: a girl named Ruby, a boy named Lyle, and the smallest, Josie, who was 6 and couldn't pronounce half the words, but who sang anyway, as if her lungs had never known how to be quiet. They sang that last line together as the lights flickered from a passing storm outside. "I'll be there." And then the rehearsal ended. Mabel gave out bread rolls she had ordered for, told them she'd see them next week, but there was no next week. When the mobs came, they came fast. They came with purpose, and they came without mercy. The Mount Zion Church was targeted early. It stood high on a hill, and its white cross was visible from blocks away. An easy marker. Mabel was inside when the fire started. No one is certain what happened next. Some say she tried to save the old piano. Others say she opened the basement doors to hide children who were running. There are no photographs, only a scrap of hymn book found, half burned in the rubble, and the smell that lingered in the air for weeks, not of smoke, but of scorched velvet and varnish, and something else, something sweeter, like old sugar, left too long on a stove. Years later, when the city tried to rebuild, there was no effort to memorialize the choir. Too small a story, they said. Too vague, no records, no names, just rumors and a few blurry recollections from survivors who remembered hearing singing before the chaos. But some did. Remembered Ruby's brother, who escaped by hiding in a meat locker, recalled her voice whenever he heard train whistles. Josie's aunt, who fled to Chicago, claimed her niece's humming had returned to her in dreams for decades afterward. And Lyle, no one knew what became of him. His name appeared on no rolls. His body was never found, but on one brick wall in a rebuilt section of Greenwood, a faint carving was discovered during a routine restoration. It read, "We were here. We sang." It became something of a pilgrimage. Not public, not commercial, just quiet. Every June, on the anniversary of the massacre, a few families would visit that wall. Some brought flowers. Others left sheet music, even if they didn't know the notes. And sometimes, if you stood very still, you could hear someone humming. Not a full song, just a line, soft, unfinished. "I'll be there." No one knew where the line came from, and those who heard it often weren't sure if they really had. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed, heavy, sacred, intact. There was once a girl named Miriam who came to the wall every year. She had no direct relatives in the choir. Her grandparents hadn't lived in Tulsa, but she had seen a painting, one that showed children singing with the city burning in the background. And something in her refused to forget it. She painted it herself over and over, each time with fewer details, each time with softer colors, until it was just a smear of red against brown, with 12 small faces in the center, featureless, yet somehow alive. Her teacher asked her why she kept painting it. She said, "Because no one else will." In 1996, a music historian named Clara Jennings began a private project. She had heard whispers of the orphaned choir during her graduate research. No solid evidence, just mentions, a name, a burned hymnal, a story of a Cain-keeping time. She couldn't let it go. Clara interviewed dozens of elders, collected fragments of songs, and reconstructed what she believed to be the final spiritual they sang. She didn't record it. She wrote it out by hand, framed it in walnut, and donated it to the Greenwood Cultural Center with a note that read, "To those who sang so we could remember." Most visitors walked past it without pause, but once a child stopped, looked at the words, and softly mouthed them without being taught. Her mother asked, "Do you know that song?" The child said, "I think I heard it before I was born." In the years that followed, the choir began to take on myth. Some said they sang until the flames reached them. Some said their voices were heard over the roar of collapsing roofs. And some, the oldest, said the fire never touched them, 'cause they were already sound by then. Sound cannot burn. But perhaps the truth was simpler. They sang because they had to, because singing was the only way to say, "We are alive, we matter, we are here." And that was all they needed. After the flames had swallowed the last timber of Mount Zion's rafters, the hill upon which the church once stood remained bare for nearly a decade. Grass grew unevenly across the scarred ground, sprouting through the blackened stones. Tona, no one, rebuilt on that slope knot at first. It was as if the ground itself held memory, and the memory refused disturbance. Greenwood changed in those years. Its streets slowly filled again. Barbers opened shop, teachers held lessons in cramped back rooms, and mothers stitched what they could from cloth that smelled faintly of soot. But some things didn't come back. The choir never reformed. No one spoke of it with finality, but it remained absent year after year, like a seat left vacant at the table for someone who would never return. People coped in small ways. Mrs. Dalton, who had once walked her daughter to rehearsals every Thursday, began humming to herself as she kneaded dough. Not entire hymns, just fragments, okay? A phrase here, a chord progression there, all stitched loosely into a tune that never quite became a song. She never taught her younger children those songs. She didn't write them down. I keep them warm, she once said, in case someone needs them again. There were efforts, of course, to reconstruct the memory of the choir. A local teacher, Mr. Elbert Gaines, tried organizing a youth ensemble in 1932, nearly 11 years after the massacre. He called them the Greenwood Voices. He taught them spirituals and work songs, and even tried to revive the unknown melody from the old hymn book, its fragment salvaged from the Mount Zion basement. But the children never sang it the same way. Mr. Gaines was a good man, patient, hopeful. T was not Mabel Thompson. T had never heard her cane tap out rhythm. He had never felt what it meant to sing in that cracked, leaky basement when the light from the stained glass window bent through the dust. And so the Greenwood voices drifted apart after 2 seasons. Some moved away. Some forgot. But not all. In 1948, a woman named Edith Brown returned to Tulsa from Detroit. She had left Greenwood as a child after the fires. She had no surviving family, but she carried a tiny wooden box, weather-worn and bound with string. Inside were yellowed scraps of paper drawings, mostly of what she remembered from her days in the choir. She had been 5 at the time, too young to remember names, but not too young to remember the way Mabel's voice had made her feel safe. Edith gave the box to a small community archive that was just starting to collect materials from before the massacre. In one of the drawings, crudely sketched in a child's hand, was a group of stick-figured children standing in a semicircle around a woman with a large bun and a long cane. Above their heads were small birds. The archivist asked her, "Why the birds?" Edith replied, "That's what it felt like when we sang, like birds flying out of our mouths." Time has a way of softening even the harshest truths. But the silence around the choir hardened instead. There were no plaques, no school named after them. Even within Greenwood's rebuilt community, their memory floated on the edges, like a tune half remembered. Perhaps that was how grief chose to survive, not by preserving, but by lingering quiet, unresolved. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, a new generation of black activists and artists began asking difficult questions about the stories that had been, intentionally or otherwise. Among them was a young musicologist named Charles Benson, who had grown up in Tulsa, unaware of the orphaned choir. He stumbled across the name in an oral history transcript during his university research and became obsessed. He visited Greenwood, interviewed the elderly, tracked down any descendants he could find. He uncovered testimonies that, while inconsistent in detail, always repeated the same core elements. The choir sang before the fire. The choir sang while it burned. The choir was never heard again. Charles didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in resonance, the way sound could stay in a place long after the voice had gone. He began recording ambient audio from the rebuilt church grounds, not for evidence, just for texture. He played it back at low volume and layered it with reconstructed hymns based on old Negro spirituals and the melody hinted at in the archive box. It became an experimental piece called They Sang Once. It wasn't released publicly. He said it wasn't meant to be listened to. It was meant to be felt. Charles left the only copy in the Greenwood Cultural Center in 1973 with the note, "These aren't songs, they're shadows." The tape was never played for tourists, but the center kept it in a drawer labeled Uncatalogued Private Collection. Sometimes a volunteer would listen alone, headphones pressed tightly against their ears, expression unreadable. When they removed them, they always sat in silence for a long time. No one ever said what they heard. By the early 2000s, Greenwood had become a complex place, part memorial, part living neighborhood, part tourist destination. Murals decorated alleyways. Statues stood on corners that once crumbled, but the orphaned choir still had no statue, no mural, no marker, until a child spoke up in 2009. During a Black History assignment at Booker T. Washington High School, a student named Clara Rose wrote an essay titled "The Choir No One Remembered." She had stumbled upon the name while helping her grandmother clean out a chest filled with old church programs and bulletins. One program from 1921 had a list of Thursday events, and the bottom line read simply, "Children's choir rehearsal to 5 p.m., Lower Hall." That fragment led Clara down a path few had taken in decades. She visited the Cultural Center, read the old transcripts, found Charles Vinson's abandoned recordings, even located a relative of Edith Brown, who still had one of the child's original sketches. Clara's essay won a regional award, then a state award, and eventually drew national attention after being published in a small history journal under the title "Singing Before the Fire." It was Clara's effort that finally inspired action in 2011. The Tulsa City Council approved a memorial to be placed near the original site of Mount Zion's destroyed sanctuary. But Clara refused a statue. She didn't want marble faces of imagined children, she said. Let them stay unseen, like they always were, but let them be heard. So the memorial became a sound installation. 12 weatherproof speakers, hidden in low benches, played gentle humming during the evening's fragments of spirituals, children's laughter, silence, and the reconstructed phrase Mabel had once taught, "I'll be there when the wind comes down." The voices were recorded by local school children. Their names are not listed, just a simple plaque that reads, "In memory of those who sang to be seen, and those who never stopped listening." Every June, people gather at dusk and sit quietly on the benches. They don't clap, they don't speak, they just listen. And somewhere between the hum of summer insects and the soft playback of children's voices, something sacred stirs, not just memory, but presence, as if the choir had never truly left. Even after the memorial was built and the hidden voices hummed through the benches each June, something about the story of the choir lingered unfinished. The songs they once sang were lost, because no one had written them down somewhere. Known spirituals, others adapted hymns. But the way they sang them, the hush before the swell, the pacing between lines, the way Mabel Thompson held a pause, just a heartbeat longer than written, those details were never captured in ink or preserved in any studio. What made the orphan choir sacred was never the melody. It was the silence around it, and silence, for all its weight, cannot be archived by 2015. The Greenwood Cultural Center had quietly become the keeper of these quiet ghosts. Visitors came to learn of the massacre, of the charred businesses, the destroyed homes, the thousands left homeless. But among the plaques and photographs in one far corner of the museum, a small drawer remained closed to the public. It held the original drawing from Edith Brown. It held Charles Vinson's audio cassette, and tucked alongside was something no one had expected, a handwritten page, unsigned, undated, but clearly copied from memory lyrics to a hymn never published. It read, "Let not the flame unmake the soul, for wind and ash still carry whole the breath we gave to every night. Our voices made the darkness light." The curator, Miss Alma Fields, had no recollection of receiving it. She suspected it came during one of the Juneteenth vigils, perhaps left anonymously by someone who remembered more than they let on. No one recognized the hymn. It wasn't part of any known canon, but it matched the fragments in Charles's tape. The melody was hesitant, slow, fragile, as though remembering itself note by note. It played just once on the recording, then silence, not static, Silence. Alma began to play the tape quietly in the office during closing hours. It never failed to stop her in her tracks. Something about the voices, especially the smallest ones, felt untethered from time. Not children pretending to sing, but children caught mid-song. No performative joy, just the raw sound of young lungs, moving air into space, making something out of almost nothing. Some evenings, Alma sat with the lights off, listening. She wasn't the only one. Staff began drifting in after hours, too. They wouldn't talk about it. They'd just sit, listen, nod, and leave. One volunteer, retired music teacher named Geneva Ross, finally said what no one had yet dared to say aloud. "I don't think it's the music we're hearing. I think it's the trying." The phrase stayed with Alma. The trying. The thought that what endured wasn't the perfection of the notes, even the survival of the singers, but their attempt, their hope, however small, however buried, however scorched. So she proposed a new exhibit. Not of the choir itself, there was too little to show, but of attempts, the little things people had done to remember. She called it, after the fire, Fragments of Trying. The exhibit opened in 2017. It included Edith's childhood sketch, now framed, the unmarked page of hymn lyrics, the faded rehearsal program, with the 5 p.m. notation, a replica of Mabel's cane, based on oral description and photos of similar models, used by blind teachers in the early 1900s, and a speaker on a loop playing exactly 3 minutes and 19 seconds of the audio Charles Vinson had left behind. There were no descriptions on the wall, only numbers. Visitors were given a small, linen-bound book with nothing but page numbers and blank space. They were invited to write down what they felt, not what they thought, not what they knew, only what passed through them. Hundreds came, many cried, but most said, "K." They sat, they scribbled, they left. Some pages read, "I hear my grandmother's breath again. It smells like singed paper and sweet bread. I didn't know I needed this." Elma collected every book after each visitor. She never reread them. She simply stacked them in the back room, tied them with string, and labeled the bundles by date. She called them the quiet archives, not meant for research, not for scholars, just for safekeeping, just in case. In the years that followed, the orphan choir began to appear in unexpected places, not in textbooks, not in documentaries, but in poems, in jazz, in whispered dedications at concerts. Young black artists across the U.S. began referencing the choir that sang through fire. Some didn't know it was real. Some thought it was metaphor, but it didn't matter. The story had entered the pot. The story had entered the pot, Stearman, but through osmosis, through the quiet need to remember what refuses to be remembered. A playwright in Atlanta wrote a short scene where children sang while their town burned. A graffiti artist in Chicago stenciled, "Let not the flame unmake the soul," on an abandoned wall. A gospel singer in Memphis sampled the phrase they sang once into a track called Ash Wednesday. No one owned the memory. It simply existed, floating, fragile, unfinished. In 2021, on the centennial of the Tulsa Massacre, Clara Rosenell, a historian herself, returned to Greenwood. She had aged, but her voice had not lost its softness. During a quiet ceremony at the Sound Memorial benches, she stood in front of a small group of children and elders and said, "We never knew all their names, and we probably never will. But we know the shape of their sound, okay? And that will always be enough." She then stepped back and let the silence take over. No applause followed, just a long, low hum, almost imperceptible, as if, for just a moment, the voices had returned. There are still no known photographs of the original choir, no official list of names, but somewhere in Tulsa, in the back of a small archival drawer, there's a page, a piece of lined paper, folded twice, slightly torn at the corner. written in careful cursive, are just 7 words. I remember the way the floor creaked. It is unsigned. It is unremarkable. But it is the most sacred artifact the center owns. Because memory isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just the echo of a footstep before the music begins. And sometimes that's enough to rebuild a world. It began with a simple cardboard box, folded at the corners, frayed at the base, unlabeled, unassuming. The kind of container most people would mistake for cluttering another forgotten relic from a lifelong packed away. But when 39-year-old schoolteacher Ada Riles opened the attic above her late aunt's house in Muskogee, Oklahoma, she didn't find dust and broken ornaments. She found silence, thick, quiet silence, like the kind in an old library just before it closes. And in the corner of that stillness sat the box. Inside were papers, stacked neatly, wrapped in a strip of faded calico fabric. There was no note, no sign that the contents were important. But as Ada gently lifted away the cloth, she saw it teach page handwritten, delicate ink strokes, a mixture of roll call sheets, seating charts, and personal observations. And at the top of the first page, written in violet ink, were 7 simple words. Booker T. Washington, Greenwood Annex, 1921. Ada knew what that meant. Everyone in her family had grown up hearing the name Greenwood, and everyone had also grown up not talking about it. Greenwood was where the past had gone quiet, where certain relatives would grow solemn in June, where her grandmother once said, "Some things got folded into God's silence." But here it was, a school register from before the massacre, before the fires, before the National Guard, before the erasure. Ada's aunt, Miss Corrine, had been a school teacher for 40 years in Tulsa. Everyone remembered her as a strict but elegant woman, always in long skirts, always correcting grammar, always knowing when someone was about to misbehave, before they even did. She died in 1999. In the attic, hadn't been touched since. But as Ada kept leafing through the pages, something became clear. This wasn't Corinne's handwriting. This register came from another woman, one Ada had never heard mentioned. On the last page of the stack was a name in slanted cursive, prepared and preserved by Miss Lucinda Webb. Beneath, in much smaller print, "In the event of violence, hide this." Ada stared at that sentence for a long time. In the event of violence. How often must one prepare for violence to leave such a note? It was a quiet, devastating thought, one that made her reach out and gently press the paper, as though trying to apologize for a century of forgetting. She read on. The register wasn't just names. It included nicknames, phonetic spellings, notes like "reads better than he admits," or "watch the left hand, he hides ink there." One entry read, "Sings while reading, could be a poet." Another, "Protects younger children, have future-in-law." Each line was personal. Each child remembered, like a mosaic of tiny details. Ada realized what she was holding. This wasn't a roll call. This was an act of refusal to let children become statistics, refusal to let their lives dissolve in the ash that history would later scatter over Greenwood. Miss Lucinda Webb, whoever she had been, had written these names not for bureaucracy, but for memory, for witness. Ada didn't sleep that night. She sat cross-legged on the attic floor, sorting pages by date. They spanned late 1922, early May 1921. The last page was different. There were only a few names. Most had been crossed out, not in anger, but in haste, as though the pen had trembled, and scrawled beside them were short phrases. Family left. Town, unclear. Seen last with uncle hiding. Not at school Monday. No word. Taken. Neighbors, unsure. Mother in hospital. No trace of boy. One entry simply read, "Fire. Too fast." Ada put the papers down. She turned off the light and she cried, not loud, not desperate, just a slow, steady leaking of breath and salt. There is a kind of sorrow that has no sound. That was what filled the attic. The next morning, Ada called her colleague, Jerome Marks, quiet man with a habit of whispering in libraries and reading historical footnotes for fun. Jerome, she said softly, I think I found something that's not in any archive. When he arrived and saw the register, he said nothing for a long time. Then he reached out. He touched the edge of one page and whispered, they were never supposed to vanish. They made copies, carefully, scanned each page at high resolution, documented the handwriting patterns, dated the paper stock, even matched the ink to known brands from the 1910s. And then, together, they began a quiet project. They called it the Web Register. Not a museum exhibit, not a news story, not yet. Just a digital archive, quiet, protected, respectful. They posted a sample online in a private forum for Black genealogy researchers. And within 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. Comments began pouring in. That's my grandmother's name. She never talked about Tulsa. My great-uncle disappeared in 1921. His name is here. That middle name, we thought it was a myth. We found her. After 100 years, we found her. Register had done what no textbook had. It had made children visible again. One of the names in the register belonged to a boy called Elijah Mayfield. Next to his name, Miss Webb had written, quiet, draws pictures in margins, gave his biscuit to a classmate last week, needs new shoes. In 2022, man in Chicago, Elijah's great-grandson, read that line and wept. His family had only ever known that their ancestor fled Tulsa. They didn't know he had drawn pictures. They didn't know about the biscuit. They didn't know anyone had ever seen him that clearly. But now, they did, and it changed them. Ada and Jerome held a small gathering at a local community center to share the story. They didn't invite the press. They didn't make a speech. They just placed the pages on velvet cloth, laid out the scans, and let people come, and one by one, people entered, one by one. They touched the pages with eyes full of silence. Some brought flowers, some brought candles. One woman brought a photograph of a child from 1919 and whispered, "This was my grandfather. He survived, but he never smiled in photos." They turned the register into something more than a document. They turned it into a memory that breathed, and from that breath, something strange and holy began to stir. A different kind of history, not the one with footnotes and headlines, but the one made of pencil marks. Songs hummed beneath breath, ink blots, and shoe sizes. The one written by teachers who knew the fire was coming and chose, anyway, to write names down, just in case. There are certain sounds the mind stores quietly. The scrape of a fountain pen across parchment. It's a soft knock of a chalkboard eraser tapped against wood. It's a hush that falls over children when a teacher enters the room. But in the summer of 1921, in Greenwood, Tulsa, there was another sound. The sound of papers crackling in flame. The sound of children not coming back. The story might have ended there, had it not been for a man who walked out of the fires with a satchel on his back, and nothing left in the world but that bag, a burned coat, and the faint scent of singed cloth, clinging to him like a memory he could not shake loose. His name was Mr. Calvin Embry. Calvin had been a janitor at the Greenwood Annex of Booker T. Washington School. Not a man who liked to talk. Not a man who expected to be remembered. But what no one knew not, even the principal, was that Miss Lucinda Webb had given Calvin a job more sacred than sweeping floors. Each Friday after the final bell, she would hand him a cloth bundle. He was to place it beneath the stairwell in the broom closet, behind the kerosene tins and cleaning buckets. If questioned, he was to say it held extra chalkboards, but it did not. Inside were pages, dozens of them, student names, observations, tiny report cards with slanted cursive notes, songs the children had written, poems they were too shy to read, aloud in one page each week, sealed in an envelope with wax, labeled personal development notes for the future. Calvin had never opened them. He didn't have to. He knew Miss Webb wasn't keeping records. She was keeping proof that these children had lived, had grown, had learned. On May 31st, 1921, Calvin came early to the school. The air smelled odd. The sky was pale. People were uneasy. He had come to polish the hallway for the end-of-year awards day. But before he could unpack his mop, he heard shouts, distant at first, then closer. By 10 a.m., he could see smoke. By noon, Miss Webb was at the door. She didn't say a word. She handed him the satchel stuffed, so full the seams, groaned. Then she looked at him with quiet urgency and mouthed, "Go." He went, through alleys, across gardens, through fences, with the bag tight against his chest as the world behind him cracked and caved and roared. He kept walking. 20 miles north of Tulsa, he finally stopped in a barn owned by a distant cousin who never asked why his coat smelled of ashdot there, under candlelight. Calvin opened the SATCHEL. Everything was there. The register, the drawings, even a folded slip of paper labeled emergency. He opened it. Inside was a simple message. If this reaches anyone, let them know the children mattered. And signed beneath it, for the first time in full, Lucinda Odessa Webb, educator, court keeper, witness. Calvin never returned to Tulsa. Not even after the fire stopped. He mailed the bag anonymously to a church in Muskogee. No note, no return address, just a scrawled instruction on the canvas flap. Protect this. Don't ask who sent it. The pastor, unsure what to do, passed it to a young woman who had once been Miss Webb's student. Her name, Corinne Riles, Ada's aunt, and she followed the instructions exactly. She wrapped the pages in calico, stored them in a box, and placed them in the attic, just as she'd been told. No, I saw Calvin Embry again. Some say he changed his name and became a railway porter. Others say he moved to Chicago, working odd jobs and quietly helping black students apply to schools. One rumor claimed he had kept a single paper from the registrar's small drawing of a boy standing under a tree, holding a book over his head as though it could protect him from rain. No one knows if that was true, but in a 1967 interview recorded on a broken cassette tape, a retired teacher from Missouri whispered, "You ever heard of the man who carried fire in a school bag? They say he saved memory from the fire." When Ada discovered this story, she searched for weeks in local archives. No one had a file on Calvin Embry. No birth certificate. No obituary. Not even a payroll record from the school. But she found one strange detail. A photograph, faded, taken in 1921. A man standing at the edge of a group of school children, broom in hand, face turned ever so slightly away, and strapped to his shoulder, canvas satchel, barely visible. But there, she made a copy of that photo and placed it on her desk. Next to it, she put a sign. It read, "The janitor who remembered." Meanwhile, the Webb register continued to quietly ripple outward. One woman discovered her grandfather had once written a short poem that Miss Webb had recorded. It read, "When I am small, I want to write, but words get tangled in the night. Miss Webb says, I am almost there. My stories float, just like the air." That man had become a jazz musician. He never told his children he had once written poetry until his great-granddaughter found the verse. She brought it to him on his 98th birthday, and the old man, thin and nearly blind, held the paper in both hands and whispered, "I didn't know she saved that." Some names in the register led to nothing. No descendants, no survivors, just an entry, a date, a comment like "scared of thunder, brave in math." But even those names did something remarkable. They turned history back into people. They reminded the world that loss is not numbers, it is children who once drew, cried, shared pencils, and walked into classrooms with shy, uneven smiles. Ada began collecting those fragments. Every drawing, every note, every possible photograph. She called the project the Quiet Archive. Not to replace museums, but to fill the silences, the ones between headlines, the ones beneath. Ashdown, the ones Calvin Embry carried on his back in 2023. A quiet memorial was built behind the Greenwood Cultural Center. No statues, just a small bronze plaque dot, and beside it, a long wooden bench shaped like an open book. At the base of the bench, carved into the wood, are these words, in memory of those whose names were nearly forgotten but weren't. And beneath that, in smaller letters, dedicated to Miss Lucinda Webb, Mr. Calvin Embry, and the children who survived. To sit on that bench is to feel something quiet move in your chest, something like breath, something like history, exhaled gently. And when the wind rustles the trees above, it almost sounds like pages turning. The past never truly stays buried. It lingers in the folds of forgotten letters, in the corners of dusty attics, in the quiet hesitations of those who lived through more than they ever said aloud. And sometimes it returns in the form of a visitor. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, nearly a century after the fire, elderly, tall, and lean, with eyes that held the weary weight of 1,000 silences. Her name was Alma Gardner, and she had driven across 5 states to sit on the bench beneath the plaque. No cameras, no ceremony, just her. She carried a small wooden box, and inside that box, tied with an aged ribbon, was a notebook. Its pages were yellowed, some torn at the edges, others smudged with what might have been charcoal or tears, or the careless fingerprints of a child long since grown. It was her sister's diary, and on the first page, in careful pencil strokes, were the words, June 1st, 1921. I don't know if I'll remember this later, so I will write it now. Alma had been 4 years old during the massacre. Too young to understand, too young to hold a memory, yet just old enough for fragments to live in her body, certain smells, certain noises, the look on her mother's face when she realized they wouldn't be going home again. Her oldest sister, Lottie, had been 10, smart, dark, quiet, and always writing. When Alma sat on the bench, she did not open the notebook at first. She just stared at the trees, watched them sway, listened to the occasional sound of tires on pavement. Far away, like history, echoing quietly across asphalt that had once been blood-soaked soil. Then she finally whispered, I didn't think this would still be here. Not the bench, not the names, not even the wind. But it was. And somewhere in that wind was the ghost of a promise her sister had once made to write it all down. Not for fame, not for history books, but so the world wouldn't get away with pretending it didn't happen. Alma had spent decades afraid to open the notebook. She kept it in a drawer, wrapped it in cloth, moved it each time she changed homes. Never told her children about it. Not because she was ashamed, but because it felt too heavy, too full of moments that might shatter if read aloud. But when she saw an article about the Webb Register, she knew it was time. The past had been asking to be remembered, and she had no right to refuse. The first pages were ordinary drawings, lists, names of classmates. Then came a single line. Today, the sky turned orange. Mama says, don't look out the window. Then another. I saw a man fall. He didn't get up. His hat rolled into the ditch. And Miss Webb said, if anything happens, remember your name. Page after page. Lottie had recorded the hours with a child's simplicity and a survivor's instinct. But the entry that Alma could never forget came near the end. It read, I saw a man with a bag. He was running. His shoes had holes. Miss Webb handed him a bundle and said, "Go." I think he was the janitor. I think he was scared, but he didn't stop. Alma had read that line 100 times. Each time, she imagined him, the man with the sac à lait, his silhouette disappearing between buildings, papers pressed against his ribs, holding the memory of children the world would soon claim never existed. After the war, after the segregation battles, after the long decades of legal silence, Alma had returned to Tulsa once, in 1972. There had been no plaque then, no benches, only the ghosts of homes, buried under parking lots in a small corner of cracked concrete where she thought the school might have once stood. She had brought flowers, set them down on the broken ground, and walked away. That day, she swore she wouldn't come back, but she had, because something changed, not in the city, but in her. She no longer believed her memories were just hers. They belonged to everyone who had ever lost something they weren't allowed to grieve. The quiet reunion happened not in a press conference or a documentary, but on a folding table in the back room of a community library. That's where Alma handed the notebook to a young volunteer named Renee, one of the newest caretakers of the quiet archive. Renee wore gloves, as instructed, handled each page with reverence, and when she reached the entry about the man with the satchel, she looked up, eyes wide. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Mr. Embry." Alma nodded. She called him the man who saved names. A week later, Lottie's diary was carefully scanned, preserved, and stored in a temperature-controlled vault beside the web register. For the first time in history, it's a first-hand account, one from a teacher, one from a child, had been placed. Side by side, one recording what was known, the other recording what was felt. In the years that followed, more fragments emerged. A button with the school's insignia, a class photo someone had kept hidden behind a dresser mirror, a letter written by Miss Webb to her sister in Alabama, never mailed, found in the lining of a suitcase sold at an estate sale. Piece by piece, the quiet archive grew, not like a museum, but like a whisper, a gathering of echoes. One by one, descendants of survivors came, not for answers, but to listen. Some brought photos, others brought silence. Many brought children young, squirming, impatient to leave, but told quietly by parents, "Just sit. This is yours too." Some days, there are no visitors, just the wind and the rustle of paper behind glass, but those are still sacred days, because remembering doesn't require an audience. It requires stillness. It requires breath. It requires the kind of listening that doesn't end when the story does. Near the back of the archive is a plaque, small and barely noticeable. It simply reads, "For the children who kept walking, even when the world said, 'Stop, forget.'" The children who survived at Tulsa Massacre were not simply victims. They were rebuilders, librarians, teachers, poets, and janitors. Some never spoke of it again. Some couldn't speak of anything else. Some tried to forget. Some tried to forgive. But all of them, in some way, carried the past forward. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility. In 2025, a distant relative of Miss Webb published a slim book of poetry based on the entries from the register. The opening poem was titled "The Man with the Bag," and the final line read, "He did not run from the fire. He ran with our names. And the ash could not catch him." There are things history books still do not say, but if you sit long enough on the bench behind the Greenwood Center, if you listen to the birds, the breeze, the weight of names resting in the air, you might hear them, the footsteps, the pencil scratches, the laughter from classrooms now long gone, and in the hush between it all, you might understand that survival is not silence. It is story, told quietly, but never lost.